us. It was actually knowing that Aaron was going to be in Europe, as he's mostly based in Vancouver, that sort of also organized roughly the time of the year where we were going to hold something like a study day. So it's a great pleasure to have you. I got an email, anecdotally, I got an email from Aaron a few days ago going, how connected to STURTEVANT does the talk need to be? And I sort of said, doesn't really matter, as connected as you feel it is, and then we'll find the connections in time. So I'm glad that we have a discussion afterwards so we can draw those connections out. I think you're going to be talking about literature and film, which is something that we definitely should address at some point during the day. So thanks very much for being here.
Okay, sound is fine, yeah? So I've titled my talk, Why Does France Have So Many Kings? And this was the question a 4-year-old asked to his father when he took his son to Versailles for the first time, and they were going around a room with all of the portraits, and Oscar, this 4-year-old, says to his dad, why does France have so many kings? I think maybe the title resonates with STURTEVANTness in a certain way. But just as a way of beginning, I want to say that I want to focus on, theoretically, some of the issues I think that intersect with STURTEVANT. But if her work is often discussed in terms of appropriation or even plagiarism, I want to shift those terms and focus instead on homage and adaptation. And so what I'm about to say won't necessarily address STURTEVANT directly, but I'm going to be kind of talking about mimesis, and I hope that I'll kind of talk around STURTEVANT's work. So it's a talk mostly about a novel by Andre Ackerman. So the novel 8 White Nights by Andre Ackerman has a complicated aesthetic DNA. On the one hand, the book is a retelling of Dostoevsky's short story, White Nights. On the other, it's a meditation on the films of Eric Rohmer. The novel has 8 sections or chapters, each of which chronicles the events of one day in the early courtship of a couple living in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Clara, the only one of the two whose name we know, introduces herself to the narrator at a Christmas party with such aplomb and assurance that he's immediately compelled, if not smitten. For yet, you guessed it, the next 8 nights between Christmas and New Year's, in a snow-covered Upper West Side, these two hapless would-be lovers, who are not yet lovers and who sort of fumble through their courtship, meet in front of a movie theater to watch the films of Eric Rohmer. Clara, we discover, has never seen them, and the narrator, who for the films have a certain kind of resonance, is trying to share them with her. The way in which early lovers, particularly those in their 20s, share their favorite things with new paramours. The movies, some of which are named in the novel, some of which are named and some of which are not, structure not only the plot of the novel as the action of each chapter ends at the theater where they're watching these films, but also the attitudes and actions of the characters. Not only do the characters discuss, ruminate, and opine on Rohmer's movies, in effect turning the narrative and the dialogue of the narrative into a kind of intermittent essay on the films of Rohmer, but also the tones and conventions of the dialogue itself begins to mimic the dialogue in Rohmer's films. In effect, the characters are based on Dostoevsky's characters from White Nights, and then they transform into characters from a Rohmer film. So, in this book, 8 White Nights, it appears that a novel is modeled after a short story, but it turns out that the novel is modeled after a short story that's mimicking the styles, conventions, and motifs of a film. The standard convention of modeling one literary work after a precursor has kind of been complicated, because of course there's a long tradition of rewriting stories, but here you have something else going on. And so The term often used in rhetorical theory is catachresis, for an extended metaphor used to describe something rhetorically. And in literary theory, the term palimpsest is often used for this. And I want to argue that this term, palimpsest, is insufficient for what's going on in this novel, and hopefully, again, this will return us to Sturtevant. So the term... So a palimpsest is a textual artifact, a scrap of papyrus or linen on which one text has been written over, thus effacing another. Throughout the ancient world, copyists and libraries were required to transcribe manuscripts roughly every 100 years because that tended to be the lifespan of a scroll. The decision of what texts would be recopied, and hence secured for another century of readership at least, was determined by both the mores and the use of the library keeping the text. In a palimpsest, however, traces of the previous text, the one that has been effaced, can remain visible. And so there's sort of two things. Hence, a palimpsest is a surface that, although through the practice of erasure, can appear to have layers, a kind of paradoxical object, a layered or a surface with depth. The term then has become a form of catachresis to describe anything that has had alterations, where the fragments of the previous remain sort of visible, so to speak, in a new form. And you'll often see this in architecture. So think, for example, of the recent additions to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. This could be said to be a palimpsest, right, in architectural terms. The reverse for term is, of course, a folly. If you don't like a thing, you call it a folly. So one librarian's trash is another manuscript collector's gold. So this term is often used to describe aesthetic objects or literary texts that are based on previous ones. Homages, imitations, or rewritings that are often described to extend this metaphor as palimpsests, or at least this metaphor of the palimpsest is used adverbally, and a text, it could be said, palimpsestically adapts the previous one. It would be easy enough to assume that this extended metaphor continued to be relevant, describing such a thing like a novel like Eight White Nights. But the main problem with this extended metaphor is that it cannot take into account the strange transposition across media that occur in this book. As such, I want to propose that a biological metaphor of mutation, or to use another word with an inherent double meaning, one that's both prosaic and poetic, adaptation, seems more apt, as in this case, we have one aesthetic form mutating or adapting into another. And so, just as a sort of a bit of a caveat here, I want to make a distinction at this point for both literary and rhetorical purposes. The intertextuality of my case study, Eight White Nights, ought to be differentiated from postmodern pastiche, as I'd argue Sturtevant's work should be differentiated from postmodern pastiche, because Ackerman's adaptation is more akin to traditional homage. One may recall Oscar Wilde's use of the term original in his reviews as dismissal of books he disliked. Eight White Nights, and I would say Sturtevant's work, is, in the Wildean sense, unoriginal. What occurs in Eight White Nights is not bricolage, like that found in, say, an early Paul Auster novel, where a series of genres and literary references are overlapped almost willy-nilly, but in this Ackerman novel, a sustained reworking from source material. Eight White Nights has, in a sense, more in common with Picture of Dorian Gray, which borrows from Irish folklores and Goethe, than with, say, the New York trilogy or even the films of Quentin Tarantino. This might be a little moot, but I'll go back to one more digression example of architecture. So in my hometown of Vancouver, we have a public library, the Vancouver Public Library, and it was opened in the late 90s. And it's a standard example of postmodern architecture, albeit like most things in the province is late. It was designed by Israeli-Canadian Moshe Safdie, and it's a pastiche and citation of the Roman Colosseum. Why a library cites the Roman Colosseum, we don't know. And so this, too, kind of brings out this distinction between a difference between pastiche and adaptation or homage. And what Eight White Nights does is a reworking. It's deliberate, conscious, and it does not smack of kind of vain citation, like the strangely Romanesque place of learning in my hometown. So to pay some attention directly to the text, the novel multiplies the time frame of Dostoevsky's short story into 2. So instead of 4 white nights, which is what happens in Dostoevsky's short story, there are 8. The characters are thoroughly modernized, although kind of ambiguously so. They use, I love this, they use mobiles with texting capabilities, but they don't seem to have computers, emails, or make more than at least one pop cultural reference to a 70s game show. So the novel kind of exists in this weird atemporal place that's maybe the early 21st century, maybe not, and this is important in a second. He also changes the ending. So it takes the template from a 19th century story and reimagines it from the perspective of 2 privileged early 21st century New Yorkers, 2 people for whom, while looking out the balcony in the Upper West Side over the Hudson during a Christmas party, time collapses. They glance across at the New Jersey skyline, which they kind of say could be anywhere else. It doesn't matter. It's just so beautiful. Oh, my God. And they list a bunch of places that kind of could be anywhere else. And one of them, the narrator says, is Bellagio. And the narrator, I'm going to quote him here, says, on special evenings on Lake Como, he says, Bellagio is almost a fingertip away, an illuminated paradise just a couple of oar strokes from the western shore. On other nights, it seems not a furlong, but leagues. That gives you something to look at. On other nights, I hate PowerPoints. I almost failed a class in my aborted PhD because I refused to do one. So I'm refusing again. Where was I? Right. I'll begin the quote again. Bellagio is almost a fingertip away, an illuminated paradise, just a couple of oar strokes from the western shore. On other nights, it seems not a furlong, but leagues and a lifetime away, unattainable. This night now, the narrator continues, is a Bellagio moment. So while they're on this beautiful winter balcony smoking, he furthers that such a moment is life on the other bank. Life as it's meant to be, not as we end up living it. A Bellagio, not New Jersey. So the loneliness of the narrator through this somewhat pathetic, poetic reverie is exposed similarly to the way the nameless narrator in Dostoevsky's story confesses his loneliness in the first of his White Nights. A few pages later, after the somewhat sentimental Bellagio reveal, the 2 characters end up discussing Dostoevsky, and the White Nights of summer are reversed. So, of course, the White Nights happen the brightest days of the year, but this is happening in the darkest days of the year, this reversal. And the white here of the night is the streetlights glittering on the recently fallen snow. I'll quote a little bit more here. Actually, she broke in. This is Clara kind of seducing him or messing with him or whatever. Actually, she broke in, almost as though wanting to change the subject once more again. If anything, tonight reminds me of St. Petersburg. And the narrator replies, or the narrator thinks, had our minds been crisscrossing, muses the narrator, while traveling on parallel lines all evening long, or would anyone looking out at our terrace instantly think of St. Petersburg? And is this a white night, or almost, I asked? We spoke about the longest night of the year and about the shortest, and how so many things, even when we're turned inside out and returned like a Mobius strip, always came out the same. We spoke of the man in Dostoevsky who meets a woman on an embankment and who for 4 nights falls madly in love with her. White nights overlooking New Jersey? I don't think so. Is it better to step out onto a terrace on Riverside Drive and look out onto New Jersey, or to be in New Jersey and make out the enchanted world of Upper West Side Jews celebrating Christmas? I thought about her question, and all I could think of was a gaping New Jersey staring out at a Manhattan skyline, asking the same question in reverse. Then I thought of Dostoevsky's stranded lovers straining ever so wistfully to catch a glimpse of both Clara and me as we longed to alight on their gaslit Nevsky prospect. So here we have this moment in the text where it's kind of becoming aware of itself in a certain sense. So whether you like this or not, if it all sounds too arch, I don't know. I think when you quote from this book, it kind of sounds kind of irritating sometimes. So I just want to sort of specify that the story is really successful on a certain level. And I think Michael Dirda in the New York Review said it best when he was reviewing the book. He says, in a sense, Andre Ackerman has written what one might call a high-maintenance novel, demanding that the reader submit to its recondite fantasies and petulant ways, but in return giving back all those unforgettable nights. So just to keep track of what's going on, slowly we're moving to Eric Rohmer, and then hopefully this will still resonate. So, moreover, though, on top of this, I'm arguing that the aesthetic complexity of the novel is quite remarkable. The scene wherein they discuss Dostoevsky introduces the first of these novels two grafts to its aesthetic genes. Ackerman here has established his first genealogy, Dostoevsky, or in this case, just Wonderful Lights. He even goes so far as to imagine that his characters are somehow cognizant of the homage that they're living in. They have a tenuous quality of coming to life and yet remaining entirely literary constructions. One is almost reminded of Michelle Bernstein's Roman à clef potboiler titled All the King's Horses, which she wrote in an attempt to publish a bestseller in order to fund the Situationist International, where the characters seem to be aware of how novelistic their whole story is. And the quote from Bernstein's text is, "We're all characters in a novel. Have you noticed? You and I speak dry little sentences. There's even something unfinished about us. And that's how all novels are. They don't give you everything. It's the rules of the game. And our lives are as predictable as a novel, too." So that's from Bernstein and this point in Bernstein's text where the characters become aware of the fact they're in a novel. I'm trying to argue that in a lot of ways, Ackerman does the same thing. So although at times the characters in Ackerman's novels can be cloying, Clara, as I'll talk about in a second, has a penchant for these kind of Rushdie-esque neologisms that just get so irritating to read, but that also kind of makes her somehow lifelike but artificial at the same time. The novel on a whole balances on a tightrope between verisimilitude and fabrication. So its balance between like liveliness and artifice relates to the films it mimics. What should we do? Should we watch the thing right now? No, we'll watch it in a second. How about that? The fact that they mimic a film, however, is also significant. If Eight White Nights starts out as an adaptation of a Dostoevsky story, as I've said, it in fact mutates into a film of sorts. The novel then is sort of doubly related to the films of Eric Rohmer. It is an homage or appraisal, while at the same time being an adaptation. The characters in Eric Rohmer's films, too, are often thought of as hapless or cloying, and the novel then mimics them. So here, I just wanted to give a little bit. I couldn't get the section I wanted to, but this is just a little bit from Pauline on the Beach, just to get a sense of, if you haven't seen Rohmer's films, to get a sense of the way the dialogue works and how kind of artificial the dialogue in a Rohmer film is.
Ah, copain. Viens. Dis-moi, est-ce que tu as déjà été amoureuse?
Non.
Mais si, j'en suis sûre. Il y a bien eu un petit garçon dans ta classe à qui tu as dit que tu te marierais avec lui plus tard, quand tu serais grande.
Ah ouais, bien sûr, quand j'étais toute petite.
Et depuis?
Rien.
Rien?
Non. Ou alors, comme ça, si tu veux, il y a bien des garçons qui m'ont impressionnée.
Et alors?
C'est tout.
C'est tout? Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Tu les as impressionnés, toi aussi?
Peut-être. En général, c'était des gens que j'ai vus un instant et qui ont disparu. Alors, je ne sais pas.
So the facility that the characters in these films have with their own emotions is sort of cloying and irritating in a certain sense, but also at the same time, somehow it works within the logic of Rohmer's work. And I'll get to this in a sec. So all forms of mimicry, even parody, are fundamentally homage. The child mimics his or her parents in order to become like them. The same child mimics his or her friends for the same reason. The tension between these modes of mimesis can produce dissonance, at least to the parents who don't want their kid to cuss. But when there is no tension in imitation, there is no interest, right? There has to be some form of change or mutation. Think, for example, of the shot-by-shot recreation of Psycho by Gus Van Sant, if anyone's seen it. I thought it was terrible. And I think it failed to be compelling because it too closely imitated its father and nothing else. My point is, and this is part of that circumlocution around STURTEVANT, all imitation is also deviation or mutation because other conditions affect its replication. So when, in 8 White Nights, Rohmer's films are introduced as a convention of plot, right? One film every eight nights, the characters themselves transform into characters from a Rohmer film. And the novel's DNA mutates from a purely literary one to a kind of hybrid literary cinematic one. And I'll quote once again. So the narrator's thinking. And he says, "What a silly, unrealistic novel," I found myself saying. Not sure why I had said that or to which of the two films I was referring, the two films they had just seen. Especially since I knew I liked both films and didn't necessarily consider realism a virtue. I had said it with an air of resigned gravity and preoccupation, attributing the vague dismay in my voice to something awkward and disturbing in these films themselves. I was simply trying to conceal my inability to come out and say something that didn't bear on the two of us. Again, as in the previous example with Dostoevsky, the characters are aware of their own model and yet somehow remain independent of it. They talk about love in the same way that characters in a Rohmer film talks about love. In effect, they mimic, or is it Ackerman mimics, characters in a Rohmer film. Clara particularly has all these kind of affectations that we would imagine a person having, thus giving her a certain kind of reality. But at the same time are some combination of naive, they come across as some kind of combination of naive and immature. And as a result, are almost verging on being that unbelievable thing in fiction. You know, has anyone noticed there's this novel that just came out in the States called Flamethrowers by Rachel Kushner? Has anyone read this? Do I continue with this digression? In the New Yorker, there was a big praising review of it, and then people have been criticizing the review, claiming that the book isn't lifelike. It's about the art world in the 70s, too. It's quite good. But I digress. Let me continue. So Clara, the character, has a series of neologisms. She coins, for example, pandangst, which she thinks means pandemic anxiety, which she uses throughout the novel, and then we as readers have to figure it out, as if everyone knew what it meant, and the interlocutor needing to be smart enough to figure out on the fly what it means. You know, like this. In this way, her made-up words serve as screening processes to figure out whom she should let in to herself. As a result, although somewhat irritating, they, in this sort of paradoxical way, become like a very believable character trope, right? Other examples include her sobriquet for the narrator. The only name we're given to him is Prince Oscar, spelt with a K, you know, just to make it Germanic, I guess. She keeps kind of throwing in German and French words, and she refers to cigarettes as secret agents, which I just found totally irritating throughout the book. The list adds up, and yet kind of becomes charming, right? So to use the narrator of 8 White Nights' phrase, like Rohmer's unrealistic characters, Ackerman has created unrealistic characters as well. So this kind of mirroring between these two things is happening. So during this discussion that he had where he's complaining about the unrealisticness of these characters, Clara asks him to promise her something, and then she falls silent, you know, like, promise me you'll never fall in love with me, which brings us, in fact, back to Dostoevsky, because in the first night of the story, of the Dostoevsky story, she says, promise never to fall in love with me, right? She hesitated before speaking, then changed her mind. "I don't think I need to spell it out," she said. Throughout the novels, the characters quote poets, discuss Rohmer as a form of code for their own feeling. And here is an example of an author quoting one of his source texts, right? He's kind of quoting it. In this thing I'm just telling you, it's a rewriting of a scene from White Nights, as I've just mentioned, where in the original one, the protagonist says, "Don't fall in love with me," and here Ackerman doesn't need us to actually have the character say that because the quote's already there. So these two sources, Dostoevsky and Rohmer, that Eight White Nights plays homage to and adapts are complicated by the fact that they are both different mediums. And this idea of sort of a transposition across media is sort of interesting to me. And I hope to elaborate on what I mean by that in a minute. They become a graft, a sort of hybrid graft through these influences. And as a result, the novel becomes as much about cinema as it does literature. Rohmer is a specifically apt filmmaker to discuss this interrelationship with because Rohmer, for example, initially wrote all of the Six Moral Tales, the films that predate these ones, as prose narratives, as books, and then he made them films. So this kind of relationship between cinema and literature that's long-standing. And this is from the Proverbs and Comedy series, so it's supposedly based on a proverb. I don't know which one. But, so, cinema. Maybe a little too obvious a statement, but cinema was the dominant cultural form of the 20th century, and I really don't think anything, even the internet's dethroned it from that kind of role. And, you know, the standard wisdom of the 19th century is that it was the novel 200 years ago. So even though cinema dominated throughout the 20th century, most apparently in the second half, cinema still required other mediums such as the novel or theater to provide the basic content material for the films, right? You adapt a play, you adapt a novel, you give it its narrative, right? So there's a paradox. Cinema, although dominant, and I'm moving back to Sturtevant, I hope. Cinema, although dominant, was dependent on literary mediums for adaptations. One might for a moment recall modernist critics like Andre Malraux and Clement Greenberg, both of whom argued that with the rise of modern art, painting could, for the first time in its own history, discuss its own form, no longer reliant on literary models for content. And in this way, Sturtevant's work this is hilarious that Lisa already said this. In this way, Sturtevant's work is strangely Greenbergian, following the idea that art takes its own content or subject matter from art. Painting itself could be content, and so the argument goes, once it during the early modern era became a dominant aesthetic form. And the sudden rise of cinema, which corresponded kind of with painting's collapse into state propaganda in the 50s, to quote Serge Guilbeault, the sudden rise of cinema changed this. Cinema, however, remained dependent on previous literary forms for narrative adaptation. But as cinema became an indisputably dominant form, it begins to influence literature. And I think we have an example in Eight White Nights, then, of a book that is being influenced sort of reversely. You know, if movies usually take from literature, now literature is taken from movies. So cinema becomes the dominant form. It begins to influence the medium that it remains dependent upon. So there's a very strange kind of relationship between these two things going on here. And in André Bazin's essay, in defense of mixed cinema, Bazin examines movies that take their source material or content from literary works. He argues that the idea that film needs to be pure from outside sources, such as literature or theater, is not only incorrect, but soon enough the influence will be reversed. The truth is, he concludes his essay, there is here no competition or substitution, rather the adding of new dimensions to the art, to what the arts has gradually lost. His argument, then, is that the pureness of various mediums ought not to be adhered to. Content from one can become content in the other. Bazin's essay feels prescient, or at least perhaps still relevant. Maybe I'm an old hack, I don't know. Particularly as cinema in the 1950s becomes incontestably dominant throughout the late 20th century. So, Eight White Nights, with its imitation of literary work and then its imitation of a filmmaker, turns out to have a rather complicated set of aesthetic genes. Its form of copying through homage and adaptation, through transpositions of mediums, transforms the book into something strange. And it's this exact kind of biological kind of metaphor, I think, that also works in the case of Sturtevant's practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. The next and last thing that we're going to see is a performance by